to such a good school with like all these different methodologies I hadn't realized how like privileged that was. And the show of that was then moving to a school that I hated because I was like, this is very classic instruction. Like they're not doing anything fun. I had ADHD and they didn't have any sort of like support or accessibility or anything for my educational needs. So it was horrible. And we were only there for a year and immediately dropped out. And then went on to like try to find a new school, right? Just finished a school year so I wouldn't lose the school year, but immediately changed schools. And ended up moving to the American School of Querétaro at the time. At that time, there were a lot of American kind of educational programs that were trying to like insert themselves into Mexico to kind of like have like a new offering. And obviously it wasn't a fully American experience, but that was kind of like what they marketed it as. And that was the other school that was like close to where I lived, and they seemed to be doing some interesting things. And so my parents were like, you were like in the British school and that was great. So maybe let's try the American system and see how that goes. So I ended up enrolling there, and it was a little better, but it definitely still felt like there was less of a focus on like just this love for education and like this attempt to trying to innovate and trying to always be better teachers, right? It became just like a traditional education, a lot of, memorizing things, a lot of teachers kind of reading off of prompts or PowerPoints. It became very obvious that a lot of the educators weren't very well prepared necessarily or weren't passionate about teaching. So it felt like, again, just a more normal educational experience. And that kind of, for me, was a really big moment of realizing how positive of an experience a specific school or the specific like passion and focus of teachers could have on a kid. So that really stuck with me for a long time.
So did the school have any, clubs or extracurricular activities or sports that like being enrichment beyond the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, they had kind of sports teams across all grades.
What would an American school be without it?
Exactly. So we had, the soccer team, the basketball team, the volleyball team, track and field, all these things. They had a very small theater program that didn't really have a lot going for it.
Did the teachers seem to like kind of be enthused about this extracurriculars, or was it just kind of something they offered just because they had to offer it?
So actually, none of the full-time teachers were involved.
Okay,
that's one thing that was also weird to me when I moved here, and I heard that when I moved to the U.S. and I've heard from people that like their history teacher was also like their basketball coach or whatever. That wasn't the case. We had like dedicated teachers, and then we had like dedicated coaches. Now that being said, I think that the coaches were, my understanding and kind of my belief is that they were paid a lot less than the teachers. And so they just kind of did that so they could focus the teachers to do one thing. And then, so it was, in a way, it was kind of like a financial move, I think.
All right. And so then when you were 17, you moved for junior, senior year to a third school to complete your full adventure.
Full adventure. Yeah. Thanks, Dad, for moving around the country. That was beautiful. Yeah, when I was 17, I moved to Monterrey, which is a city that's about an hour and a half from the border with Texas. And there I enrolled once again in the American school because at that point it was like a somewhat easy transfer to do.
Were the American schools connected in any way? Did they kind of have like an umbrella organization, or was it just different American
Those
schools?
two weren't. The Monterey American School did have an umbrella organization with an American school in Mexico City and with an American school in Guadalajara, but they were not connected to the school that I had been to. They were both just like American system schools, if you will, and so yeah, it wasn't that necessarily one was already tied to the other, but they were like, oh, you're coming from the system, whatever, take these tests, do this thing. And that was actually something else, because that high school really very much was trying to be like, your American high school experience. And the building itself looked like, the nicest high school TV show or movie that you've seen, like those facilities. That's kind of what it looked like. They had a bunch of teachers that they like tried to bring that were like super prepared from whatever functions or whatever disciplines they taught. They had a bunch of AP classes. They had they had a lot more clubs and a lot more programs, and all of that was super new to me. I was shocked. I was like, wow, that's not at all what I've been doing before. And this was also like a pretty pricey private school at that point. So I was lucky enough to be able to, get some scholarships and, be able to go to that school. And at this point, my parents started, doing better and better as I was obviously like, these moves for cities were obviously to like try to
beneficial for the career.
Beneficial to the career of my dad.
And
so like, that obviously was to try to get the whole family to do better. So, very blessed to have progressed like that. So yeah, a combination of me getting some scholarships and like my dad doing better off. But it was kind of shocking. I really kind of felt out of place there, and I felt really disconnected from a lot of the students. These were kids that were the 1% of the 1% and had been so their whole lives.
Were all the students from Mexico, or were there any students kind of international?
There was some international presence. They marketed themselves in a way as like the international school, and so there were kids from. Let's see. There was a big Kia factory close to the city, so a bunch of Korean families came to work for Kia, and then a lot of students joined the school. There was a bunch of random American and Canadian people here and there. There was a few other international students from different countries that just kind of like found themselves in Monterrey. So yeah, not international in what you might think of, where like 50% or more of the school is of international. Right. But yeah, maybe I want to say like 10% of the school.
Okay. And how big were that? Like how big was your graduating class? Let's say.
I think. That graduating class was about 150 people.
Okay.
I might be wrong.
It's a medium size, yeah.
Yeah.
So what was obviously this sounds like academically they had a lot of resources. They had a lot of resources for extracurriculars. What was the college preparation like in the application process from the school?
Very, very intense. To your question, it was huge. Monterrey is an hour and a half drive from the U.S. and it's a 10 to 12 hour drive from Mexico City. So this is a city that is much more connected to the United States and to American culture than it is to Mexico and central Mexican culture. So yeah, being the American school and being in a place like this, they made a huge push for the students to all kind of like go to U.S. schools. I think the statistic for my year was that about 65% of my graduating class went to U.S. universities, and only about 35% went to Mexican universities.
Okay.
We had a fully dedicated college counselor who was very, very good. She spent half her time, and when I say half her time, I really mean I think almost half her waking time. She spent about half her time touring schools in the U.S., making contacts with admissions counselors, trying to understand what exactly each school was looking for, trying to build relationships and report with them. And she spent the other half of her time getting to know students and like helping them prep and doing all that work. Shout out to Ms. Sarah Loring. You're amazing. I don't think you're going to listen to this or this podcast, but yeah, she was incredible. I reached out to her early once I got there. I think by the time I was 17, I kind of realized that the kind of stuff that I wanted to study and that I wanted to do wasn't necessarily getting a lot of support from Mexican universities. So, sustainability, policy, economic development, most of the people that I knew were either trying to be engineers or doctors or lawyers. And that is what most universities in Mexico kind of like specialize in. So I kind of felt like what I wanted to do was a little out of place.
So you knew kind of going into this school that you wanted to apply to universities in America?
I knew that I wanted to look at options outside of Mexico. I wasn't sure that it was going to be America. I just felt like...
Perhaps that's my chauvinism speaking.
All good. I just kind of knew that I hadn't found what I wanted in schools in undergraduate or graduate programs in Mexico. So I reached out to her early, got to know her. She was very kind. She was very helpful. I kind of like walked her through my interests, through what I wanted to do. And she actually was the person who first suggested that I apply to Georgetown. She was like, listen, I hadn't even heard of this school. She was like, listen, this place is really cool. I think it would go very well with your interests. I personally know their dean of admissions for Latin America. I can put you in touch with him. You can like meet him. They're going to like come in. I think this was September. And she was like, they're going to come in November for like a tour so you can like talk to him, whatever. So yeah, I mean, she really opened my eyes to the educational opportunities out there. She connected me directly with this guy. And so I'm pretty certain she is a very large portion of the reason why I was able to eventually go to Georgetown for my undergrad. But yeah, I mean, it was crazy, right? The school was very, very focused on placing students in good schools in the United States. And again, partly I think because of the culture and because of the expectations, but also partly just because I think it was a sort of like good marketing strategy in a way, right? Like if you can tell students of different schools, like, hey, if you come to my school, there's a 60% chance you end up in a university in the United States. I think that's very attractive, especially again in the city where in that city where like the U.S. and like going to the U.S. it seems like a very attractive proposition to a lot of people. The American dream, if you will.
Schools here in the U.S. too. I know the private schools love to put on their brochure all the logos of the colleges their graduates go to, and when they get a new one, if no one at your school had gone to Georgetown before, I'm sure they're happy to add Georgetown onto that brochure.
Yeah, no, I don't know if anyone had gone before. I think maybe a couple, but maybe, yeah. I'm sure they were elated that we all got into good schools that year.
Yes, I'm sure I'm sure your families were as well.
Oh yeah, for sure.
All right, great. Well, that is great. Thanks so much for sharing. It was really interesting to hear about all the schools you went to and your experience.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Zam, and to share some stories.
Absolutely. All right. Goodbye for now.
Take care.
Lastly, for today, we have the Chicago Policy Review, where we interview a writer from the Chicago Policy Review about a recent article they published. The review article will probably be about education policy, but if it's not, we'll try to make them talk about education anyway. Today, we are joined by staff writer Adam Leader-Smith, who spoke with us about an article he recently published about student debt in America and the potential policies being looked into to mitigate this issue. Adam, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so student debt is in the news a lot these days. We hear a lot about the student debt crisis. Could you give us a bit of background to the kind of the history of student debt in the U.S. and the current scope of the crisis?
Yes, absolutely. So student debt, the way that people in the United States have paid for college has changed a lot over the course of the past century plus. I mean, a century plus ago, a lot of people weren't even going to college. That changed in the middle of the 20th century. Partly it was due to the Cold War, due to changes in, the structure of the economy at large. And early on in the middle of the 20th century, first of all, there was the GI Bill, in which GIs coming home from World War II had college educations subsidized. Those were white male GIs. Mm-hmm. And then in the middle of the 20th century, in 1965, there was the Higher Education Act, in which established sort of the skeleton of how the United States would pay for education in this country. And to start off with, it was mostly financed through grants or through federally subsidized loans. That has changed a bit over time. So the 1970s, the Pell Grants were introduced, which were a grant to lower income students or students who were in need. But then later on in the 1980s, with Ronald Reagan and sort of the backlash against high taxes and government spending, there was a big shift to instead a sort of debt-financed model of education, with the idea being that education is an investment in yourself, and it makes sense to be willing to put up some amount of debt in order to then get a good job, get a good career, pay it off down the line. Mm-hmm. So that was a big shift starting in the 80s. You'll notice nowadays the Pell Grant doesn't come close to paying for even a four-year public tuition. Mm-hmm. And in addition, the other big change has been that those federally subsidized loans that were backing private banks are now no longer. Those started being phased out in the 1990s with the first introduction of FAFSA, Stafford loans, and a lot of other things that are now more familiar to people who apply for college in this day and age. And then under Obama, now all student loans are directly offered through the federal government.
So right